صوتك أسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإن القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another in our series, Reflections on the Qur'an. We'll try to wrap up our discussion of an-naskh today, abrogation. In our previous episode, we started talking about the main Quranic evidence that's used as evidence for the principle of abrogation, that abrogation occurs within the Qur'an, one verse abrogating another. And the first verse that's mentioned in that regard is verse 106 from Surah Al-Baqarah. مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا نَأْتِ بِخَيْرٍ مِنْهَا أَوْ مِثْلِهَا. We started talking about that in the last episode, the translation of it. Whatever ayah that we cause to be superseded or forgotten, we replace with something better or similar. Do you, meaning the Prophet ﷺ, do you not know that Allah has power over everything? Now, part of the discussion in this regard is what exactly does the word ayah mean in this verse? And we started discussing the various meanings of the word ayah, that originally it meant a token that was sent along with a message by which the recipient of the message would know that this messenger bringing this message has been authorized, he's really been sent by the person who is supposedly the source of the message. So, like for a king, it would be putting his stamp, his seal on the wax by which the letter was sealed. Or sometimes they would send some belonging with the messenger so that the recipient would know, oh yeah, I recognize that. I know that that belongs to my friend, so this message must really be from that friend. So the original meaning of ayah was a token or a sign or an indicator that was sent along with a message to indicate that the purported sender of the message really was the sender of it, and that the messenger was to be trusted with regard to the message they were delivering. Now, through a process of expansion of meaning, this is what happens in the way people use language, the word ayah also came to be used for the message itself, not just the token that indicated its authenticity. That's according to Ibn Ashur, the great 20th century mufassir of the Qur'an and major scholar of Islam. And with regard to Allah sending messengers, then the word ayah came to be used for the miracles that those messengers worked in order for people to realize that, hey, this is not an ordinary person. So the miracles were caused by Allah, they were brought into being by Allah at the hands of the messengers as a token that these people who were claiming that they'd been sent by Allah, they really had been sent by Allah. And we also mentioned that the word ayah or ayat is used in the Qur'an for verses from previous revelation, that Allah mentions that there are some people of the book who are devout and that they stay up at night to recite the verses of Allah. And for a Jew or a Christian, they wouldn't be reciting the Qur'an, they'd be reciting their particular scriptures. And in that regard, Abu Muslim al-Isfahani, that's how he interpreted this verse from Surah Al-Baqarah. He said that what it's referring to is a change of a law, or more than one law, from a previous Sharia, the Sharia of a previous prophet, in the context of the legal system that was being given to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And if we look at that entire passage, he certainly has the context, certainly has pointers in favor of that argument, because from around verse 40 up until about verse 140, roughly, that whole discussion is either addressing the Jews or telling the Muslims about the Jews and their history and their attitudes toward the Muslims, analyzing their relations with the Muslims and inviting them to Islam, and then also warning the Muslims about certain aspects of their attitudes and their behavior that would be a cause for concern. And at the end of that whole passage, we have the verse that mentions the change of the Qibla. And Al-Qurtubi, when he talks about verse 106 from this surah, the one that mentions changing an ayah, let me just read the translation for you. Whatever ayah that we cause to be superseded, that's the translation that was used here for naskh. Whatever ayah that we cause to be superseded or forgotten, we replace with something better or similar. Do you, Prophet, not know that Allah has power over everything? So Qurtubi mentions a sabab nuzul for this verse. Now, he doesn't mention any isnad for it, and there is no isnad. Al-Wahidi, who collected a specific set of narrations, he composed a book, the most famous book on sabab nuzul by Al-Wahidi. He collected a story relating to the verse in Surah An-Nahl that refers to replacing one verse in the place of another, substituting one verse, one ayah in place of another, that it caused people to say to the Prophet ﷺ, you're only making this up. So Wahidi did mention a sabab nuzul without any isnad, and that sabab nuzul, many scholars have explicitly stated that it's false. And why is that? Because Surah An-Nahl was a Meccan surah. At-Tabari collected a narration which mentioned that only the last 3 verses of Surah An-Nahl were revealed in Medina. That's the dominant position of scholars of tafsir, although there is some disagreement, but those who have a different view, they didn't bring any proof for their opinion. So for this story of Wahidi's to be put in context, the people who are objecting to a substitution of one verse in place of another in Mecca, they were mushriks. They were pagan Arabs. And the way that Wahidi tells the story is that these people were saying, this Muhammad, he's just playing around with the minds of his followers. One day he tells them to do this, and then the next day he tells them to do that. So clearly he's making it up. What makes that story implausible is that Mecca was a place where there were very few rules for the Muslims. It was a period in which they were being asked to build their belief. And according to a narration by Ibn Abbas that's collected by An-Nasa'i and authenticated by Shaykh al-Albani, Ibn Abbas mentioned that the first case of abrogation was the change in Qibla which occurred in Medina. So there was no abrogation of laws in Mecca. So that sabab nuzul that Wahidi mentioned regarding the verse in Surah An-Nahl, it's clearly false. And another indicator that it's false is that passage goes on to mention that the reason for this substitution of a verse in place of another was to strengthen the hearts of the believers. Now, if there were laws being changed, that would be more likely to cause a certain kind of uneasiness in the hearts of the believers, which is why we took this long detour to come back to Surah Al-Baqarah when we see the change in Qibla being discussed in that around verse 140 something. The first time it's mentioned, it says that the foolish people are saying, what is it that this Qibla is being changed from one thing to another? So that's an indication that there was a reaction to it in the society, that people were making objections. What's going on here? Why is he changing? So when Qurtubi said that the Jews were the ones who raised the objection, and in the similar terms as was mentioned in Wahidi's sabab nuzul, they said Muhammad is just playing around with the minds of his followers. One day he's telling them this, and then the next day he's ordering them something else. Although there's no isnad for Qurtubi's narration, from the context it makes sense that the Jews would definitely object, because up until that time they kind of had a patronizing attitude to the Prophet ﷺ that, yeah, you know, he's following our religion, you know, he's praying towards our Qibla. So when the Qibla changed, it was like, what's going on here? And you can tell from the Qur'an itself that this was a test of faith for the believers. And at the beginning of that passage, Allah mentions that we only appointed the Qibla that you used to be upon in order to test the believers who would follow the Prophet ﷺ and who would turn back on his heels. It'll come time for a break, so we'll be back in a minute, inshallah.
Where truth is hidden, misleading quotations create confusion. Where truth is hidden, lack of knowledge and wisdom cause upheaval and commotion. Where truth is hidden, manipulated scriptures and twisted facts emerge. This very hidden truth creates false propaganda, mayhem, chaos, disorder, and turmoil in our lives and the world order. But is there anyone with courage and wisdom? What is the truth, and who has the courage to expose it? Because it's your right to know the truth.
Watch truth prevail and lies perish in Truth Exposed by Dr. Zakir Naik tomorrow at 9 p.m. and repeat telecast at 7:30 a.m. Saudi Arabia on Peace TV.
Pearls of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Abu Yahya, Suhaib ibn Sinan ar-Rumi, may Allah be pleased with him, reported that the Messenger of Allah, may peace be upon him, said, "Amazing is the case of a believer, for there is good for him in every affair, and this is only in the case of a believer. If prosperity attends him, he thanks Allah. Thus, there is a good for him in it. And if adversity befalls him, he endures it patiently, and there is a good for him in it." Sahih Muslim, Volume 4, Book of Softening of Hearts, Hadith number 7138.
Dialogue. Discussion. Debate. Rebuttal. Conclusion.
Eliminate misconceptions about religion. Get enlightened.
Witness Dr. Zakir Naik in a battle of words in Crossfire, next on Peace TV.
Welcome back. Assalamu alaikum. We're talking about how the change of Qibla really was a major test for a lot of believers. Allah mentioned that, He said, we only appointed the Qibla, He's addressing the Prophet ﷺ, we only appointed the Qibla that you used to follow in order to test the believers. Who would follow the messenger and who would turn back upon his heels. And then the passage goes on to say, wherever you happen to be, when it's time to pray, turn your face toward al-Masjid al-Haram, the Kaaba. And the fact that this was a real issue that troubled some believers, we get a sense of that from the fact that the order to turn the face toward the Qibla, toward the Kaaba, it's mentioned 2 more times, a total of 3 times within a space of about 6 or 7 verses. So the need to reiterate the command indicates that this was a major issue for some believers. So if we look back to Wahadi's story about the revelation of that verse in Surah An-Nahl, when some people challenged the Prophet ﷺ that a verse was put in place of another, and they said, you're only making this up. that passage goes on to say that this process was in order to strengthen the hearts of the believers. Well, you know, it was a major test for the believers when the Qibla was changed. So changing laws is not the kind of thing that one would associate with reassuring the hearts of the believers. Now, the way that Al-Jabri and Abdul Karim al-Khatib, these are modern mufassirs, the way that they interpret the passage in Surah Al-Nahl, that Allah says, whenever we put one verse in place of another, they say that this is a case not of replacement, but displacement. And what that means is that the Qur'an was being revealed piece by piece. And so a portion would be revealed, and then later another verse would be revealed, and that would be placed within a passage that had been previously revealed. And one of the reasons for this piecemeal revelation, this is mentioned in several places in the Qur'an. It's mentioned in the passage that we're discussing right now in Surah Al-Nahl. It's mentioned also in Surah Al-Furqan, that one of the reasons for gradual revelation was in order to strengthen the morale, to strengthen the heart of the Prophet ﷺ and the believers, because they were being subjected to severe persecution by the people in Mecca. And so verses kept being revealed to put their trials in perspective, reminding them about prophets who had come before and the trials that they went through, and also reminding them that the help of Allah would be coming to them. So the need for these verses, the psychological need of the Muslims in Mecca for these verses, was an ongoing need. And so these kinds of verses kept being revealed, and they would be placed within existing passages. So the way that those surahs were organized kept going through a process of change. And that was what caused the objection on the part of those pagans in Mecca. And the point that Abdul Karim al-Khatib made was that poets in that time would sometimes work on a poem for a period of months, stretching into years. So they would keep reworking what they had already written and delete something, add something, rearrange, until they were satisfied. And so what those pagan Arabs were criticizing the Prophet ﷺ, when they saw something that looked like that in the process of the development of the Qur'an, they said, you're like a poet. You know, you're adding stuff and taking it out and rearranging. This is clearly an indication that you're composing this work just like poets compose their work. So that explanation for me of the meaning of the passage in Surah Al-Nahl is quite convincing and compelling. If we return back to the passage in Surah Al-Baqarah, one of the problems for the dominant explanation of the meaning of that passage is that you have this phenomenon of variant recitations. There are 7 to 10 reciters of the Qur'an from the early days whose recitation is considered authoritative and canonical. And there are some slight variations between their recitations. This is a really long topic. We don't have time to get into it. But the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that the Qur'an was revealed in 7 ahruf, 7 aspects. And that hadith is considered mutawatir in meaning. There are so many different Sahaba who narrated it that it must be authentic. So you have a variant recitation of this verse in Surah Al-Baqarah where it says, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نَنْسَأْهَا. Instead of nunsiha, it's nansa'ha. Nunsiha means cause to be forgotten, and nansa'ha means delay. So how does the explanation of abrogation, how do you accommodate that wording of delaying and derive a coherent meaning based on your interpretation? It caused a lot of problems for the scholars who were committed to that interpretation. One explanation is that delaying refers to a verse that is left unrevealed. So Abu Ubaid, Al-Qasim ibn Salam, who wrote a book on abrogation, he mentions that interpretation, and he says, nansakh means here copy or transcribe, in which case it would refer to the revealed Qur'an in its entirety. And so what he's saying here, there's a Qur'an that was revealed, and there was a Qur'an that was delayed. You know, it has not been revealed. I mean, this raises a major question, which is, why would Allah have another Qur'an waiting up in the heavens that He didn't reveal, and why would He bother to tell us about it? Ash-Shafi'i took a different approach that makes the delay of revelation temporary. That is, when a verse's revelation is delayed, another verse is revealed in place of it. So this would seem to invert the relationship between the abrogated and the abrogating. The abrogating verse is being delayed, and the abrogated verse is being revealed ahead of time. So the delay refers to the abrogating verse. To me, that's still a strained explanation. A third interpretation of delaying it is that it's left unabrogated. So the first verb there, nansakh, means it refers to verses that are being abrogated, and nansa refers to verses that are being left unabrogated. Well, the entire statement says that we replace it with the like of it or better than it. So if it's left unabrogated, then what's being replaced? All of these have real problems to reconciling the variant narration into that interpretation of what the passage as a whole is referring to. Now, we mentioned Abu Muslim's explanation of this passage. There's also another modern explanation by Muhammad Abdu, the scholar who was the dean of Al-Azhar around the turn of the 20th century. He has a tafsir, Tafsir al-Manar, dictated from his verbal. He would give lessons, and somebody wrote down his lessons. And I think he died before he finished the Qur'an, but this portion, he had discussed it. And so he looked at the word ayah, and he said, I don't think the interpretation that it means a rule of the Qur'an, a verse, that it makes sense here. He returned it back to meaning a miracle of a prophet. So when Allah said, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ, said whatever miracle we cause to be superseded, what that meant is that some prophets were given miracles that other prophets were not. Later prophets came and they weren't given that miracle. And Allah causing a miracle to be forgotten. Well, there are many prophets who are mentioned in the Quran. We don't know what their miracle was. So that's clearly applicable. And then delaying a miracle, he said that refers to the demands that people would make of their prophet, that give us a miracle like so-and-so had, that Allah is not at anyone's beck and call. And so He might choose to provide a miracle like what they're asking for. He may not, or He may eventually bring a miracle like what they're asking for, but delaying it. And in the meantime, He would provide other miracles. Now, one of the consideration by which he seals his argument is the end of that verse says, don't you know that Allah has power over all things? So if ayah in this verse was referring to legislation, it would be more appropriate to mention that Allah is all-knowing and all-wise, because that's the kind of attributes that we should be reminded of with regard to Allah as the lawgiver. But when it comes to mention of His power, that's more appropriate to His providing miracles to prophets in the form of ayat. We've come to the end of this episode. Thank you for viewing it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wallahu a'lam.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن اصبح بصوتك اسمع